I had an email this week, because this is what we're talking about. I had an email this week about someone got in touch saying, "Hey Pete, I have some issues with my pelvic floor. I've never really recovered from it. Can you recommend an online pelvic floor program?" Because that HPMB at healthypostnatalbody.com, I don't really do much on the pelvic floor other than, see if, a women's health specialist or a women's health pelvic floor physio, do your Kegel exercises, and use a core breath, which obviously comes from start at the pelvic floor rather than diaphragmatic breathing and all that sort of stuff, which doesn't. I still believe my way is better, by the way. I'm still to come across anyone that has managed to convince me otherwise. So to recommend the pelvic floor program is tricky. I know I did an episode on the pelvic floor quite a while ago, where I explained just how complex the pelvic floor is. And this is why you can do a recovery program for almost all areas of the body, except for an online recovery program, except for the pelvic floor and potentially lower back and all that sort of thing, without a physical examination. Of course, at Healthy Post Natal Body, we have in the program, there's a standard disclaimer, mainly for Americans, so you guys don't sue me, right? This standard disclaimer that it would help if you get checked out by a GP or a specialist before you start any sort of exercise program. Now, that is not just so that my insurance company still likes me. That is to pick up on any bits and bobs that you have missed. Right? You could have one or two injuries you're not really aware of that might impact your recovery. Now, like I said, that is usually just a statement that's in there to keep you from suing people. However, when it comes to the pelvic floor and lower back, that, to some extent, when it comes to the pelvic floor, that really, really matters. Because the pelvic floor is such a complex area, and most people don't really know how it should feel. Like if you have diastasis recti, right? To stick to the subject, if you have diastasis recti, you kind of know whether your core is working or not, and you know which bits of your core are working or not. You either have muscle engagement or you don't. You have diastasis recti. The gap appears in certain places or it's everywhere. So it's above navel or below navel or it's completely open, right? You'll feel whether the muscles are working when you place your hand on it. So it's fairly easy to diagnose. The problem with the pelvic floor is, first of all, it's a complex area of the body, much more complex than the core is. Much more complex. And secondly, most people are not aware how it should feel. Most people will feel, most women, especially guys, are screwed with the pelvic floor, right? They have no idea how it should feel. But most women can sense something is different postpartum, but they can't quite put their finger on it, so to speak. And because there are that many areas to the pelvic floor that could be causing a problem, it becomes a bit trickier to self-diagnose. And this is why, unless you know what the dysfunction is, you can't really repair the problem. As I always talk about, as I always say, if you don't know what A is, you can't plan the route to B, right? And I know those of you listening who've listened before and who listen regularly will be aware that I always say this. If you travel to Manchester, it matters whether you start from Glasgow or you start from Edinburgh, right? For Americans out there, if you go to New York, it matters whether you start from Chicago or San Francisco. And the sat-nav plots a different route. And I know all you Americans are thinking, Jesus, you jackass, you didn't need to specify that. We understood what you meant. You didn't have to bring American cities into it. But I'm that kind of guy. I'm inclusive. So unless you know what your A is, you don't know how to get to B. And for diastasis recti, A is very obvious. The solution is also very obvious. A well-designed postpartum program for diastasis recti kind of covers all the bases. It means that you have to put the people creating the program have to put a bit more thought and effort into it, which is why you should only work with people that know what they're talking about and not that know how to plan these things, such as me and one or two other people that I could mention, but I don't. But a well-designed program for diastasis recti covers above navel, below navel, and completely open. And we make sure that everything gets hit a little bit. We cover the muscle activation part so that everything above navel, below navel activates properly, and that's where we start. And we make sure that after the first 4 to 6 weeks, at least everything is firing up the way it should. That's fairly straightforward to plan. That is not that difficult to do. It really, really isn't. Once you know what you're talking about, you can just get that done. Any pelvic floor specialist will tell you that is also the case with the pelvic floor, but you need a physical examination first to determine what works and what functions and what doesn't. Let me put it that way. So you need someone who knows what they're talking about to have a look, so to speak, to check under the bonnet and say, okay, is this muscle doing what it's supposed to do? That interview I did with Jessica Marie, the running interview that I did with her about the psoas and all that sort of stuff. Most people don't really have a clue how their psoas should feel. They kind of just know that. This is Jessica Marie Rose, yeah. They kind of just know that they should be able to do certain things, but they don't know that it's the psoas. Within the pelvic floor, most people in general, but most women don't really know how it should feel at the best of times, let alone postpartum. And then if you don't know how it should feel, you still don't really know which muscle does what and which muscle should do what. It's like I said, it's a complex bit. So you really need an expert to have a look at this. And an expert, any pelvic floor physio, pelvic health physio, a women's health physio, will say, okay, I know where we are and I know how now to get to B. I know what the issue is and I know how to fix it. Right? You can't do that online because you can't self-diagnose, and the people who try to sell you this stuff online, and I've seen a few recently, they just give you a generic program, as in this will help. And that is just not really how the pelvic floor works. A generic program just has you wasting your time. And that is usually the biggest concern that I come across for any sort of professionals. If you are, say, 3, 4, 5, 6 months postpartum, you're still very much in that recovery stage where your body is really quite keen to get back to functionality and all that sort of stuff. And dysfunction, so muscles not working properly, that's what I mean when I say dysfunction. Dysfunction isn't like built into the system yet. Other muscles aren't overcompensating and all that sort of thing. Whereas if you're 10 years down the line and then you try to get this thing fixed, a lot of muscle, you have a bit of muscle wastage. So not only dysfunction, but muscles, if you don't use them, you lose them, so to speak. Or kind of. They get a lot weaker anyways. And other muscles really start to compensate. And then you're building a lot of dysfunction and imbalance into the system, which will need an awful lot more work. Right? So if you don't know what's wrong at the beginning, then all the exercises you're doing afterwards, you're kind of just guessing your way from A to B. And chances are you're missing something because it's so complex. So please don't waste your time on online pelvic floor systems. Interview I did a long time ago with bio something or other. I will link to it. I will link to it in the podcast description as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll have one of those little pop-up-y things with the link to the podcast episode. I just can't remember. The tiers, the pelvic floor thing we did. That stuff works, but it only works after an examination, right? And that's also what the lady, and this really annoys me now, that I didn't look that up. It's because I'm a jackass. I know this. That I didn't, like I said, that I didn't look up. But the lady also said, and she really knows what she's talking about, get the examination done first before you buy these products, because you might be buying the wrong thing. And that is kind of how you need to view these things. So don't buy any online programs for pelvic floor. Just see a specialist and have them write you out a program. They're not that expensive. Pelvic floor programs online, I've seen them go from 60 to 150 pounds, or from, what is that, $90 to $200. And it's usually just as cheap, so to speak, to make an appointment with a pelvic floor specialist. It's actually, most pelvic floor specialists are nowhere near that expensive. Get a little program for them, and then have a follow-up visit a month or two down the line, during which you get new exercises and all that sort of stuff. That is how I would do it. There is just no point in buying an online program. With regards to, if you want to follow people on the internet and all that sort of stuff, Claire Bourne is obviously one of those people who's phenomenal. She's a pelvic floor physio, and she really knows what she's talking about. And she doesn't do it in an oversimplified way, right? Because it's so complex, it's very tempting to fall into black and white solutions and only present those. Claire doesn't do that, and she's really, like I said, she's excellent on that sort of stuff. In fact, I should invite her onto the podcast at some stage of proceedings. Anyways, don't waste your money. That's all I'm saying on that particular subject.